The courtroom buzzed with the tense energy of finality. The Honorable Judge Mary Matthews sat at the bench, her eyes scanning the room with an air of practiced authority. Her gaze lingered momentarily on the two key figures seated at opposing tables. Michael Nielsen, stoic and defiant, and Wanda Nielsen, her expression smug and triumphant. The judge cleared her throat and began reading the verdict, in a tone that brooked no argument. "I'm awarding Wanda Nielsen use of the house until the children graduate from high school," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "Mr. Nielsen will continue to make all mortgage and utility payments on the house. She will also receive half the value of the business her husband owns." Before diving into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future stories. Michael shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing yet. Wanda's attorney glanced at her with a subtle nod of satisfaction, while Michael's lawyer leaned closer, whispering something urgent into his ear. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line as he ignored the advice. Judge Matthews continued, unfazed by the palpable tension in the room. "Mrs. Nielsen will keep her vehicle, and Mr. Nielsen will continue the payments for said vehicle. I am also awarding Mrs. Nielsen 60% of all assets, including bank accounts, investments, and retirement funds. Furthermore, I am granting primary custody of the children to Mrs. Nielsen, with visitation following standard protocols. Child support will be set at $750 per month per child, for a total of $1,500 per month." Michael's grip on the edge of the table tightened until his knuckles turned white. He spoke, "Since Mrs. Nielsen has not worked outside the home for the last 5 years, I am also ordering spousal maintenance in the amount of $2,000 per month," Judge Matthews declared, her tone devoid of empathy. "The divorce will be finalized in 90 days unless Mrs. Nielsen revokes the petition." She reached for her gavel, prepared to end the proceedings, when Michael's voice rang out, clear, sharp, and utterly defiant. "No!" The single word hung in the air like an uninvited guest, silencing the murmurs that had rippled through the courtroom moments before. Judge Matthews froze mid-motion, her gavel hovering just above the block. Slowly, she rose halfway from her seat, her head swiveling toward Michael with an intensity that suggested disbelief. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice laced with incredulity. "What did you just say?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers in an unflinching challenge. "Are you confused by the N or the O? If it's unclear, I'd be happy to define it for you." Gasps echoed through the room as Wanda's lawyer audibly inhaled, while Michael's attorney buried his face in his hands, muttering something unintelligible. Judge Matthews' expression darkened, her features transforming from shock to a fury so intense it seemed to radiate heat. "I will give you 1 minute to apologize," she said icily, "or I will cite you for contempt of court." Michael smirked, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Well," he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "at least you'd make one correct ruling today. I have nothing but contempt for this railroad you're running here." "Sounds." The judge's glare could have frozen the surface of the sun. She settled back into her seat, her fingers gripping the gavel tightly as she contemplated her next move. 30 days, she declared sharply. "You'll spend 30 days in jail for contempt." Michael didn't flinch. Instead, his smirk widened into a full grin as he responded with mock enthusiasm. "In that case, why don't you take this?" He raised his right hand, middle finger extended in an unmistakable gesture, "and shove it up your dried up." 90 days, Judge Matthews roared, banging her gavel so forcefully that the sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot. Chaos erupted. Wanda looked horrified, her lawyer stunned into silence. Michael's attorney turned to him, hissing urgently, "Are you out of your mind? Shut up before she locks you up for a year." But Michael was already rising to his feet, his smirk undiminished. 2 bailiffs approached him, their expressions a mix of professional restraint and disbelief. As they led him out of the courtroom, Michael turned back one last time, locking eyes with Judge Matthews. "See you in 90 days, Your Dishonor," he said with a wink. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, he began laughing, a deep, uncontrollable laugh that echoed down the hallway long after the courtroom door slammed shut. The judge sat frozen, her face flushed with rage. For a moment, she simply stared at the door through which Michael had exited. Finally, she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." The gavel fell once more, signaling the end of a hearing that no one in the room would soon forget. The memory of Judge Matthews' gavel echoed in Michael's mind as he sat in the holding cell, staring at the cold gray walls. It wasn't the first time life had tested his resilience, and he doubted it would be the last. As he leaned back against the hard bench, his mind wandered to the events that had shaped him, the values ingrained in him since childhood, and the decisions that had brought him to this moment. Michael had been raised in a small town in the heartland of America, where traditional values weren't just taught, they were lived. His parents, a hard-working middle-class couple, believed in the principles of honesty, fairness, and respect. His father often said, "Your word is your bond, and trust is something you earn, not demand." Michael had absorbed these lessons deeply, but there was another side to his upbringing that often clashed with those values, his unyielding stubbornness. As a child, Michael was known for digging in his heels when he believed he was right. His mother would call it determination, but his father was less forgiving. "There's a fine line between standing your ground and being a mule," he'd warn, though it rarely stopped Michael from pursuing what he thought was just. That stubborn streak stayed with him through adolescence. One particular memory stood out: his fallout with his cousin Harold. They had been as close as brothers, inseparable through childhood. But one Saturday night, Michael happened to walk past the local theater and saw Harold with Cheryl, Michael's on-again, off-again girlfriend at the time. Though Michael and Cheryl had recently argued and technically broken up, Harold knew they were likely to reconcile within days. The betrayal hit Michael like a punch to the gut. By Monday, Michael's grudge was set in stone. When Cheryl approached him at school to apologize, he didn't say a word, simply walking away. Harold, too, tried to make amends, but Michael met him with nothing but silence. Even years later, after stealing Harold's girlfriend as petty revenge, Michael refused to acknowledge him. Some people deserve forgiveness, he thought, but others deserve the consequences of their actions. It was this response that had Michael overcoming his worries about Billy's accident. It was this response that would make him remain. Michael's life took a sharp turn in his 20s. After earning an economics degree and an MBA, he landed a lucrative job at a major company. With his sharp mind and natural knack for numbers, he excelled in the stock market, quickly amassing a small fortune. But it wasn't until he met Wanda at a friend's party that he felt his life was truly falling into place. Wanda was captivating, with a smile that could light up a room and a presence that drew attention wherever she went. Their chemistry was immediate, and Michael was smitten. She wasn't just beautiful, she was charming, witty, and seemed genuinely interested in him. Before long, they were inseparable. The early years of their relationship were filled with joy. Wanda had a degree in art history, though she jokingly referred to it as her degree in latte design, since it qualified her to work as a barista. She gave up the job shortly before their wedding, settling into her role as a homemaker, while Michael focused on building their future. Together, they bought a beautiful 3-bedroom home and began planning for a family. Life was perfect. At least, it seemed that way. When Wanda announced her pregnancy, Michael was over the moon. "Hurry up and get showered," she had said that evening, a radiant smile on her face. "We're going out to celebrate tonight, Daddy." He could still remember the way she'd said that word, Daddy. It was the happiest night of his life. But as joyful as the announcement was, the months that followed were even more exciting. The pregnancy brought another surprise: twins. Michael couldn't wait to meet his daughters, already imagining the ways he'd spoil them. He wanted to be the kind of father who was present, supportive, and loving, the way his own father had been. The day his daughters were born was one of pure elation. He held the tiny, perfect babies in his arms, marveling at their little fingers and toes. But as the weeks turned into months, a small, nagging thought began to creep into his mind. A thought he worked hard to suppress. The twins had blue eyes. Bright, striking blue eyes. At first, he shrugged it off as a genetic anomaly. Surely, someone in our families has blue eyes, he told himself. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't recall a single relative on either side with blue eyes. His were brown, a muddy hue inherited from his father. Wanda's were hazel, with no hint of blue. He began mentally cataloging every relative, searching for an explanation that never came. The doubt festered, growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, during the twins' second birthday party, his mother's casual comment confirmed his worst fears. As Michael stepped out of the ensuite bathroom, he overheard her speaking to his aunt in the hallway. "I just can't figure out where those blue eyes came from," his mother said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Have you asked Michael about it?" his aunt replied. Michael froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. "Oh God, no," his mother continued. "I can't even imagine what would happen if he found out they weren't his. He's so happy, it would kill him." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Michael backed into the bathroom, locking the door behind him as his mind raced. "They have to be mine," he thought desperately. "There has to be an explanation. Someone in the family must have blue eyes." But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the sinking feeling in his stomach wouldn't go away. That night, after the guests had left and the twins were tucked into bed, Michael sat alone in his home office. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sadness. He looked at the photos on his desk, Wanda smiling with the girls at the park, her arms wrapped around them lovingly. How could she do this to me? He wondered. How long has she been lying? As much as he wanted to confront Wanda immediately, he knew he needed proof. If she had betrayed him, he wasn't going to let her take everything he'd worked so hard to build. That's when the suspicion that had been brewing for years solidified into a resolve. He was going to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Michael sat alone in his dimly lit office, the soft glow of his computer screen casting shadows on the walls. His mind churned with questions he couldn't answer and doubts he couldn't shake. The laughter and memories captured in family photos on his desk now felt like cruel reminders of a betrayal he had yet to fully confirm. For days, he had tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for his suspicions, but logic offered no solace. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface. This wasn't something he could solve on his own. He needed proof, definitive, irrefutable proof. With a heavy sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed the number of the private investigator he had researched earlier that week. The next morning, Michael met with the investigator, a sharp-eyed man named Daniel, whose demeanor exuded quiet confidence. They spoke in hushed tones over the sound of the office's hum. "What exactly are you looking to find out, Mr. Nielsen?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but direct. Michael hesitated for a moment, the enormity of his suspicions weighing heavily on him. Finally, he said, "I need to know if my wife is having an affair. And I need to know if my daughters, if they're really mine." Daniel nodded, unfazed. "I'll need access to her devices, phone, tablet, computer, anything you can provide. And if you want paternity testing, I'll require samples from you and your daughters." Michael slid a small envelope across the desk. "This has everything: phone records, her schedule, and the addresses of the places she frequents. I've also included toothbrushes from the girls and myself for the DNA test." Daniel's eyes flickered to the envelope, then back to Michael. "I'll get started immediately. Expect a full report in 2 weeks." The days that followed were agonizing. Michael threw himself into work, hoping the distraction would dull the edge of his anxiety. Yet every time he saw Wanda, smiling as if nothing was wrong, it only deepened the knot in his stomach. He avoided her as much as possible, pretending to be swamped with projects or errands. At night, he stared at the ceiling, imagining every worst-case scenario until exhaustion claimed him. Finally, 2 weeks later, Daniel called. "Mr. Nielsen, I have the results. Can you meet me at your office?" Michael agreed, his voice tight with apprehension. When Daniel arrived, he carried a thin folder, which he set on the desk between them. The investigator's usual stoic demeanor carried a hint of unease, and Michael braced himself for the worst. "I'll get straight to the point," Daniel began, opening the folder. "The personal trainer, blonde hair, blue eyes, has been meeting with your wife at his apartment twice a week. Sometimes she brings your daughters with her. Audio recordings from inside the apartment confirm that they both know he's the biological father of the twins." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind struggling to process the words. His hands trembled as he reached for the folder. Inside were photographs of Wanda and the trainer, their interactions far too intimate to dismiss. There were transcripts of conversations, undeniable in their content. But it was the DNA test that delivered the final blow. 2 words stared back at him, stark and unrelenting. Not a match. Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said, though his words held no gratitude, only a hollow resignation. He set the folder down, his hands clenching into fists. "This confirms everything." As Daniel left, Michael sat in the silence of his office, his world crumbling around him. Anger surged through him, followed by a deep, aching sorrow. He had given Wanda everything, his trust, his love, his life, and she had repaid him with deceit. But as the hours passed, sorrow gave way to resolve. He would not let her betrayal define him. Slowly, he began to formulate a plan. Wanda may have taken his trust, but she would not take his future. Michael sat at his desk late into the night, the room lit only by the soft glow of his computer screen. The file Daniel had given him lay open beside his keyboard, its damning contents etched into his mind. Betrayal stung, but Michael wasn't a man to wallow in despair. If Wanda thought she could outmaneuver him, she was about to learn how deeply mistaken she was. The first step was safeguarding his financial future. Over the next several days, Michael meticulously reviewed his accounts, investments, and assets. Every dollar he had earned, saved, or invested was now a potential target in the looming divorce battle. He wasn't going to let Wanda or the courts take it from him. He began by establishing a network of offshore accounts. With the help of a discreet financial consultant, he funneled the bulk of his savings into institutions beyond the reach of U.S. law. Transfers were small and carefully staggered to avoid raising suspicion. Stocks and investments were liquidated, with the proceeds routed through layers of intermediary accounts before landing in secure, untraceable havens overseas. Each transaction was meticulously logged and categorized under innocuous labels: expenses for non-existing business ventures, repayments on fabricated loans. By the time he was finished, his domestic accounts were little more than empty shells, their balances reduced to figures that painted him as a man barely scraping by. Michael also dissolved any joint accounts he held with Wanda, citing restructuring for tax purposes as an excuse. If she noticed, she didn't question it. Meanwhile, he transferred ownership of his most valuable physical assets, such as his car and personal equipment, to a newly formed LLC. On paper, he appeared broke. His financial maneuvers complete, Michael turned his attention to the legal side of the equation. He met with his lawyer to discuss the looming divorce proceedings, presenting himself as cooperative but cautious. "Let her think she's winning," he told himself. "The more confident she feels, the easier it will be to catch her off guard." By the end of the week, Michael's strategy was set. His wealth was beyond Wanda's reach, safely out of the country. All that remained was to put the final pieces of his plan into motion. The twins' third birthday arrived on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The house was a whirlwind of activity, filled with balloons, decorations, and the sound of children's laughter. Wanda had spared no expense, ensuring the party was a spectacle. Family members from both sides crowded the living room, chatting and mingling as the twins toddled between them, their bright blue eyes sparkling with excitement. Michael moved through the celebration like a shadow, his smile carefully curated for the occasion. He felt like an outsider in his own home, watching a scene that no longer felt real. The questions gnawed at him. How long had Wanda been deceiving him? Did she truly believe she could hide this forever? Was she that lost within herself that she wanted to run away from him? As the party reached its peak, Michael excused himself to use the ensuite bathroom. It was there, just as he was about to step back into the hallway, that he overheard the conversation that solidified his suspicions. "I just don't understand where those blue eyes came from," his mother said, her voice low but audible. "No one in our family has blue eyes." "Have you asked Michael about it?" his aunt replied, and she agreed fully. "Oh, heavens no," his mother whispered. "He's so happy. It would destroy him if he found out they weren't his." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He felt his pulse quicken as a wave of anger and grief threatened to overwhelm him. He stepped back into the bathroom and locked the door, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him looked the same, but everything inside him had changed. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was certainty. When he returned to the party, Michael's demeanor was calm, his mask firmly in place. He laughed when expected, posed for photos, and helped the twins blow out their candles. But inside, his mind was racing, running through the steps he needed to take next. He was done being passive, done doubting. It was time to act. As the last guests departed and Wanda began cleaning up, Michael slipped into his office. He opened his laptop and began reviewing his preparations. The accounts were secure, the paperwork in place. His conversations with his private investigator and lawyer had confirmed what he already knew. Wanda's betrayal was complete, and now so was his plan. With a final glance at the photos on his desk, Michael closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "It's your move now, Wanda," he thought. "Let's see how you like losing everything." The courtroom was packed, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. The Honorable Judge Mary Matthews sat high on her bench, her gavel resting within easy reach as she surveyed the room with her signature scowl. Wanda sat beside her lawyer, looking smug and self-assured, while Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. It was a pivotal moment. Wanda and her attorney were confident that this would be the day they secured the financial windfall they believed was theirs. Michael, however, had spent months preparing for this exact confrontation, and he was ready. In the court, the judge asked. The proceedings began with Wanda's lawyer standing and delivering his demands with a practiced air of authority. "Your Honor, my client seeks to secure what is rightfully hers in this divorce. We request child support for 2 children, spousal maintenance as previously ordered, and half of the business value that Mr. Nielsen sold without disclosing the details to this court." Judge Matthews nodded, her gaze shifting to Michael. "Mr. Nielsen, do you have any response to these demands?" Michael rose, straightening his tie as he looked the judge squarely in the eye. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call a representative from the company that purchased my business to provide clarity on the matter." The courtroom murmured in surprise as a young woman in a sharp black suit stepped forward. She introduced herself with calm confidence. "Your Honor, I am Emily Carter, representing the board of directors for the firm that acquired Mr. Nielsen's business." Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Ms. Carter." Emily glanced briefly at Wanda's lawyer before addressing the court. "It is our position that Mrs. Nielsen has no claim to the business, as the sale was finalized before the divorce was filed. The transaction was conducted overseas, and the funds from the sale were transferred to accounts outside of U.S. jurisdiction. As such, they are not subject to division under this court's ruling." The room fell silent. Wanda's lawyer's confident demeanor faltered as he processed the implications of Emily's statement. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. "Where exactly are these funds now?" Emily remained composed. "The initial transfer was made to Belgium, but the funds have since been moved. To where? I cannot say. That information is beyond my purview." Judge Matthews leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Nielsen, is this accurate? Did you sell your business before filing for divorce?" Michael smiled faintly, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. Every detail of the sale was legal and above board. The timing of the transaction was purely coincidental." Wanda's lawyer interjected, his tone now openly accusatory. "Coincidental? Convenient, don't you think? And what about the proceeds from the sale?" Michael turned his gaze to him, his expression unreadable. "The proceeds are where they need to be. Beyond that, I have no further comment." Wanda's frustration boiled over. "You're lying," she exclaimed, rising to her feet. "You've hidden the money. You're trying to cheat me and your children out of what's ours." Michael's composure never wavered. "Not my kids, not my problem. Not my wife, not my responsibility," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. His words landed like a hammer, silencing the courtroom. Judge Matthews' face hardened. "Mr. Nielsen, I would caution you to maintain decorum in my courtroom." Michael inclined his head slightly. "Of course, Your Honor, but I believe the facts speak for themselves." The remainder of the hearing devolved into heated arguments, with Wanda's lawyer scrambling to salvage his position. Michael remained unyielding, his strategy airtight. Emily's testimony left no room for doubt. The business was sold legally, and the funds were untouchable. The termination of the hearing was only rooted in agreement between district court judges and outside magicians held by the Washington Post that the government had granted an untouchable leave. When the session ended, Wanda's once confident demeanor had crumbled. Her lawyer looked exhausted, and even Judge Matthews seemed frustrated by the lack of leverage against Michael. As he exited the courtroom, Michael allowed himself a small smile. The battle wasn't over, but today, he had won. Michael leaned back against the cold, hard cot of his cell, staring up at the cracked ceiling. County jail wasn't luxurious by any stretch of the imagination, but it was far from unbearable. The monotony of the days gave him ample time to think, plan, and, surprisingly, adapt. If Judge Matthews thought throwing him in jail would break his spirit, she couldn't have been more wrong. The first few days were the hardest. Adjusting to the rigid routines, bland food, and lack of privacy was a challenge, but Michael quickly found ways to make the best of his situation. He used the yard to work out, building his strength and passing the time with weights and cardio. He wasn't interested in making friends, but it didn't take long for his courtroom antics to make him something of a legend among the inmates. "You're the guy who flipped off Judge Matthews, right?" one of them asked during their first interaction in the yard. Michael smirked. "That's me." The respect he earned from that moment carried through the rest of his stay. In a place where reputation was everything, being known as the guy who stood up to the system gave Michael an edge. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Meanwhile, life outside the jail walls wasn't going so smoothly for Wanda. With Michael in custody, she quickly found herself overwhelmed by financial strain. The mortgage on the house went unpaid, the utility bills piled up, and her once prized Lexus was repossessed when she missed several payments. Her parents, already wary of her choices, reluctantly allowed her and the twins to move into their spare bedroom. Wanda's smug confidence from the courtroom days began to erode as the reality of her situation set in. She had assumed she could force Michael to cave, to hand over the money, and maintain her comfortable lifestyle. Instead, she found herself drowning in debt, her every attempt to extract resources from Michael thwarted by his meticulous planning. Back in jail, Michael received word of Wanda's struggles through his lawyer, who visited regularly to update him on the situation. "She's lost the house," she said one day, a slight smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And the car. She's living with her parents now." Michael nodded, unsurprised. Good. Let her feel what it's like to lose everything. But not everyone shared Michael's perspective. Wanda's cousin, a short-tempered man named Dean, decided to take matters into his own hands. Believing he could intimidate Michael into giving up the supposed hidden funds, Dean intentionally got himself arrested for a minor offense, landing him in the same county jail. When Dean arrived, it didn't take long for his intentions to become clear. He made no secret of his disdain for Michael, glaring at him from across the yard and muttering threats under his breath. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat one day, approaching Michael with balled fists. "You're going to pay for what you're putting Wanda through." Michael didn't flinch. "I'm already paying," he said evenly, gesturing to the cell block around them. "But if you're looking for a fight, I suggest you think twice." Dean didn't listen. He lunged at Michael, but before he could lay a hand on him, several other inmates stepped in. "Hey, back off," one of them warned, shoving Dean aside. "You don't mess with him." Dean's attempts to confront Michael continued over the next few days, but each time he found himself blocked by the unwritten rules of jail politics. Whether through accidental collisions during exercise or spilled trays in the cafeteria, it became clear that Dean was outmatched. By the time he was released, he was nursing more bruises than he had arrived with. For Michael, jail became a proving ground, a place where he solidified not only his physical strength but also his mental resilience. He spent hours sketching out the next steps of his plan, ensuring that when he walked out of those gates, he would be ready to retake control of his life. As the days turned into weeks, Michael found a strange sense of clarity. The distractions of the outside world were gone, leaving him free to focus entirely on his goals. Wanda had tried to destroy him, but her actions had only sharpened his resolve. By the time his 90 days were up, he was stronger, smarter, and more prepared than ever. When the guards finally led him to the exit, Michael stepped into the sunlight with a faint smile. He had been tested, but he hadn't broken. Wanda had underestimated him, and that, he thought, was her biggest mistake. Michael sat on the porch of Howard's ranch, the golden light of the setting sun stretching across the rolling fields. It was a rare moment of calm, though his mind was anything but. After weeks of careful preparation, everything was in place. Tonight he would leave the life he'd known and the wreckage Wanda had tried to make of it behind for good. Howard and his wife Cheryl had been instrumental in the plan. Despite their rocky history, they'd stepped up when Michael needed them most, offering not just their ranch as a temporary base, but also their network of trusted contacts. Among them was Julia, Michael's sharp and resourceful lawyer. She had become more than just his legal counsel. She was his partner in every sense of the word, a co-conspirator and confidant. As twilight deepened, Julia arrived at the ranch, her car packed and ready. She stepped out, her tailored suit replaced by casual clothes that hinted at the new life ahead. "Everything's set," she said, handing Michael a plain manila envelope. Inside were the documents that would officially transform him into Greg Cooper: a new passport, driver's license, and bank details. Michael examined the papers briefly before nodding. "And the arrangements on the other side?" "Handled," Julia replied with confidence. "We'll fly into Mexico City, lay low for a day or two, then head to Costa Rica. By the time anyone realizes you're gone, you'll be sipping cocktails on the beach." Michael smiled, a rare expression of genuine relief. "I owe you for this." Julia's lips curved into a sly grin. "You can pay me back in margaritas." Their faces reflected radiantly from the photograph they were studying. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, Michael packed the last of his belongings into the bed of a battered old truck Howard had lent him. The vehicle was a relic, but it was perfect for staying inconspicuous. Howard clapped him on the back as he loaded the final box. "You sure you're ready for this?" Michael looked at him, his expression resolute. "I've never been more ready." Howard nodded, his eyes reflecting both pride and a touch of sadness. "Take care of yourself out there, and don't be a stranger." As Michael climbed into the truck, Julia followed, sliding into the passenger seat. Cheryl waved from the porch, a quiet farewell that spoke volumes. Within moments, they were on the road, the ranch fading into the night behind them. The journey to the airport was uneventful, their path carefully planned to avoid unnecessary attention. Julia had rented a car, and they switched vehicles halfway to avoid leaving a trail. By the time they reached the parking garage near the international terminal, they were just two ordinary travelers embarking on a vacation. Inside the airport, Michael's transformation into Greg Cooper was seamless. The fake passport Julia had arranged passed through security without a hitch, and they boarded their flight to Mexico City without a second glance. As the plane ascended, Michael glanced out the window, watching the lights of the city shrink beneath them. It was a moment of finality, a goodbye to everything that had come before. 2 days later, Michael and Julia arrived in Costa Rica, stepping off the plane into the humid embrace of the Caribbean coast. They had prepared meticulously for this new chapter, investing in a small cantina and a charter fishing boat business under their new identities. The cantina, nestled in a vibrant seaside village, was a perfect cover. It would allow them to blend in, earn a modest income, and build a life that was both simple and fulfilling. As they stood on the sandy beach outside their new home, Julia turned to Michael with a smile. "Ready to leave all this behind?" Michael, now Greg, took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. He looked out at the turquoise waves lapping at the shore, the horizon wide open and full of possibilities. "I've never been more ready," he said, his voice steady and sure. In the months that followed, Greg and Julia adapted to their new lives with surprising ease. The cantina quickly became a local favorite, its lively atmosphere and friendly owners endearing them to the community. Greg's charter fishing business attracted tourists and locals alike, his natural charm making him a trusted guide. Together, they built a life that was as far removed from the chaos of the past as possible. At night, they would sit on the porch of their modest yet comfortable home, sipping drinks and listening to the sound of the ocean. It wasn't the life Michael had once envisioned for himself, but it was a life he had chosen, and that made all the difference. Wanda sat in her parents' cramped spare bedroom, the harsh glow of her phone screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. The once confident woman, who had strutted into court demanding everything from Michael, now found herself reduced to near ruin. It had been months since she'd been forced to move back in with her parents, and each passing day seemed to bring a new wave of misery. At first, Wanda had tried to maintain her usual air of superiority. She told herself, and anyone who would listen, that Michael's downfall was imminent. "He can't hide forever," she would insist, her voice trembling just enough to betray her uncertainty. But the reality of her situation was impossible to ignore. The house she had fought so hard to secure was gone, foreclosed after months of unpaid mortgage bills. Her beloved Lexus, the symbol of her once comfortable life, had been repossessed. Even her parents, though sympathetic, were growing weary of her presence. Her financial situation was dire. The waitressing job she'd taken at a local diner barely covered her expenses, let alone allowed her to provide for her daughters. The once lavish birthday parties and shopping sprees were distant memories. Now, every dollar she earned was stretched thin, and the constant struggle left her feeling trapped and humiliated. Wanda wasn't the only one facing unexpected consequences. Judge Mary Matthews, who had presided over Michael and Wanda's case, found herself in the middle of her own personal scandal. Known for her harsh rulings, particularly against men in family court, she was accustomed to wielding power with an iron fist. But what she couldn't control was the betrayal brewing in her own home. One afternoon, as she returned early from work, she discovered her wife of several years in bed with another woman. And, shockingly, a man. The revelation sent ripples of humiliation through the judge's life. The betrayal was compounded by the financial fallout. Her wife had 3 children from a previous relationship, whom Judge Matthews had adopted. Now she was legally obligated to pay child support and spousal maintenance. The irony of her predicament wasn't lost on those who knew her, least of all Michael, who heard about it through his network. The same legal system she had used to crush men like him was now turning its sights on her. Meanwhile, Wanda's attempts to track Michael down yielded nothing. Her lawyer had done his best to follow the trail of Michael's financial dealings, but every lead ran cold. Offshore accounts, falsified records, and shell companies made it impossible to pinpoint the location of his assets, or even Michael himself. With each failed attempt, Wanda's frustration grew. Her personal relationships began to crumble as well. Friends she had once relied on for support distanced themselves, unwilling or unable to handle her increasingly erratic behavior. Her parents, though still providing a roof over her head, made it clear that their patience was wearing thin. "Wanda," her mother said one evening, her voice heavy with exasperation, "you need to figure out your life. This can't go on forever." "I'm trying," Wanda snapped, her voice breaking. "Do you think I want to be here?" Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "It's not about what you want, it's about what you need to do." By the time her daughter's next birthday rolled around, Wanda had hit rock bottom. The celebration was a quiet affair in her parents' living room, with a homemade cake and a few small gifts purchased on clearance. Gone were the extravagant parties and expensive decorations. Her daughters, too young to understand the full scope of their mother's struggles, seemed content. But for Wanda, the day was a painful reminder of how much she had lost. As she watched her daughters blow out their candles, Wanda felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The life she had envisioned, a life of luxury, stability, and control, was gone, replaced by a grim reality she couldn't escape. Michael had outmaneuvered her at every turn, leaving her with nothing but regret. Judge Matthews, meanwhile, struggled with her own version of rock bottom. Her once untouchable reputation was tarnished, and her financial obligations left her teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Her ex-wife had moved her new boyfriend into the home they had once shared, a cruel twist of fate that left the judge fuming with bitterness. When news of her predicament reached Michael, now Greg, in Costa Rica, he couldn't help but laugh. Sitting on the porch of his cantina with Julia by his side, he raised a glass to the poetic justice of it all. "Karma's a funny thing," he remarked, clinking his glass against hers. Julia smirked. "It certainly is." As time passed, Wanda's life continued its slow spiral. Though she eventually managed to find a small apartment and scrape together some semblance of stability, the scars of her downfall remained. She was a shadow of the woman she had once been, haunted by the knowledge that her own choices had led her here. In the end, both Wanda and Judge Matthews became cautionary tales of betrayal and hubris, their stories serving as stark reminders that actions have consequences, often far greater than anticipated.